Chapter 5. Printing Comes to Europe. Printing with movable type is widely regarded as the single most important cultural achievement in history. With the mechanization of printing comes the wide distribution of literacy and information. The invention birthed the Renaissance and enabled technology to spread to create both the Industrial Revolution and the Information Age. Without printing, there would be no computers, no internet, no modern medicine, no space exploration, no life as we know it today. But how did it start? By the turn of the first millennium, printing on paper was already well established in China. Meanwhile, the era of illuminated manuscripts was in full flower in Europe. Factory-style hand production by scribes, illuminators, and rubric painters could not begin to keep up with an enormous demand for books. With high demand and limited supply, there was a fortune to be made in the book market for anyone who could find a way to speed up the process. Europe was ready for print. A middle class of tradesmen, craftsmen, business, and landowners was emerging, and universities were educating more lay students. Reading was not just for clergy and the aristocracy anymore. Two breakthrough technologies, relief printing and papermaking, slowly made their way west from China. The conquest of Spain in the 700s by Moors, the sophisticated Muslim inhabitants of northern Africa, brought printing and other Asian technology to Europe. At a time when Europe had only 2 universities, the Moors had 17. As Europeans returned from the Crusades in the Holy Lands, the mingling of European and Middle Eastern soldiers, merchants, and civilians further spread the learning and culture of the East. The first ingredient in this tech revolution was paper. Invented in China around the year 100, paper made it to Samarkand by 751, Morocco by 1125, Spain by 1150, France by 1189, and Cologne, Germany by 1320. The art of making paper by hand is still practiced with precision and care by artisans such as these at the Duodam Paper Mill in New York City. These French designs are early artifacts from a European paper mill. Called watermarks, the wire designs embed marks in the wet paper pulp during the papermaking process. The pressure from the raised design makes the paper thinner and more translucent, so the mill's signature is visible when held to the light. Perhaps you recognize the two-tailed siren or mermaid symbol. Starbucks got their logo from a 15th century German print. The sirens of Greek legend lured sailors onto the rocks with their hypnotic songs and were adopted as a symbol of seafaring and trade. With paper came new techniques including xylography, or relief printing from a raised surface. Some of the earliest printed objects to circulate were playing cards. As in China, they were used for games of skill, chance, and fortune-telling. This Moorish deck probably arrived in Europe via soldiers. Playing cards introduced the non-literate masses to symbol recognition, sequencing, and logical deduction, and paved the way for reading. This Latin deck from the 1400s was woodblock printed and colored by dipping fingers in paint. The shields show the influence of Islamic culture, with a suit system derived from early Arabic cards. Cards became popular throughout Europe by the 15th century. New methods of production made them cheaper, and common people could play the same games as courtiers. Think about it. What did you learn first? How to read, or how to play simple card games? Block books were woodcut picture books with religious subject matter and brief text. Image and lettering were cut from a single block of wood, and each page was printed as a complete word and picture unit. The combination of word and picture, then as now, was an effective way to learn. This woodblock print of St. Christopher from 1423 is one of the earliest dated European block prints. The unknown illustrator depicted the legendary saint, a giant who carried travelers safely across a river, bearing the infant Christ. This image effectively uses changing contour line width to show form. This letter K is from an alphabet book circa 1464. The curious pictures probably helped both children and adults learn their letters. A popular topic for block books was the Ars Moriendi. These manuals on the art of dying advised readers on the preparation for and meeting of the final hour. Death was an ever-present preoccupation in these years due to the great cycles of bubonic plague or Black Death. Plague killed 1/4 of the European continent's inhabitants during the 14th century and caused 1,000 villages either to vanish completely or be critically depopulated. This engraving from 1656 is a caricature of a plague doctor, Dr. Schnabel von Rühm. The uniform of a plague doctor included a beaked nose mask stuffed with herbs to ward off bad air, a stick to push people out of the way, and a waxed coat which kept out blood and pus, but alas, not fleas. With the market for books booming in the bustling cities of Europe, a number of inventors tried to crack the new technology. By the middle of the 15th century, several printmasters were on the verge of perfecting the techniques of printing with movable metal type. In Mainz, Germany, a city rich with booksellers, a corrupt and powerful church, and wealthy merchants, a brilliant metalsmith named Johann Gutenberg raced in secret to solve the problem. Gutenberg's invention was really at least 6 inventions: the concept and design of the matrices, the materials and design of the molds, the recipe for the molten metal that had exactly the right characteristics for casting and printing, the system for aligning the letters and holding them in place, the correct ink recipe, and the screw-driven press adapted from the design of a wine press that could print double-page book spreads. Gutenberg started experimenting with printing in the 1430s. By 1450, he had obtained backing from the financier Johann Fust, and he spent about the next 5 years creating 200 copies of his masterwork, the 42-line Bible. In the meantime, he also produced letters of indulgence, which were sold by clergy as proof of pardoned sins. Basically, he was printing money. His beautifully printed Bible was unveiled at the 1455 Frankfurt Book Fair and cost the equivalent of 3 years' pay for the average clerk. Now let's hear more of the story from the author of the new novel, Gutenberg's Apprentice.
My name is Alex Christie, and I'm the author of Gutenberg's Apprentice. My novel tells the story of the first great media revolution in 1450, the invention of printing. It's an extraordinary story of tremendous achievement and struggle to create something that no one had ever seen before, and at the same time a very personal tragedy because it blew up and the entire partnership imploded at the end. Everyone thinks that Johann Gutenberg was the lone genius who created the Gutenberg Bible. It was, in fact, a collaboration between 3 men. I like to think of it as the world's first tech startup because you had Gutenberg, who was a serial entrepreneur and an inventor who undisputably invented movable type. But in order to create this 1,262-page book, he needed a venture capitalist, a man named Johann Fust, and the hero of the novel, a scribe who was Fust's foster son, they believe, named Peter Schoeffer. It's a fiction. That's the most important thing to me. It's a story. It's my effort to put together the mosaic pieces of what the historians know happened. And to me, it's a tremendously exciting story. I think that with any new technology, we have an intuitive awareness that we're gaining something, but we're also possibly losing something. And this is one of the reasons that I felt very, very connected to Peter Schoeffer. For example, with the e-book, there are tremendous advantages, but at the same time, the physical book is something we obviously still feel very attached to. So I think having a story that talks about the importance of the book and where it came from and the long history and our love affair with physical books, I just hope people will reflect a little bit on the meaning of books in their own lives.
Gutenberg's partners Fust and Schoeffer went on to run one of the most successful printing companies in Europe. This page detail is from their Latin Psalter of 1457. It was a monumental prayer book with 3-color printing in lead type, and the earliest example of color printing in Europe. In this book, the innovative small type is combined with wonderfully intricate printed red and blue initials that evidence the early printer's efforts to mimic the design of a manuscript book. For a brief few years, printing remained centered in Mainz. Ironically, the swift spread of printing was hastened by a bloody conflict. As an army descended upon the town, forewarned merchants and craftsmen loaded everything on carts and fled. Many never returned, establishing presses as far away as France and Italy. In the same era, an unidentified artist known as the Master of the Playing Cards created the earliest known copperplate engravings. Engraving is printing from an image that is incised or cut down into a printing surface. The finest work of the Master of the Playing Cards is a set of playing cards using birds, animals, and wild men as suits. Some scholars suspect that Gutenberg may have been involved in this masterpiece as well. Today, the traditional art of letterpress printing is enjoying a revival. At Kutztown, we have restored a small press from the late 1800s. The Landis Press is named after Professor John Landis, who taught communication design here from the 1970s through the 1980s. Try your hand at the very same process used by Gutenberg and his partners in 1450. Early printed books are called the incunabula. That's plural for incunabulum. These books were printed from Gutenberg's invention of typography around 1450 until the end of the 15th century at 1600. Some of them are still being repaired today. The literal meaning of the word in Latin means cradle or birthplace. The birthplace of printed books was Gutenberg's town of Mainz. The new technology quickly spread outward with an explosion of printing towns in Europe. By 1500, books were everywhere. Books in Latin, the language of scholars, dominated, but books in German, French, Italian, and others helped to crystallize separate national languages and spread literacy across Europe. The majority of publishers were located in Germany, the center of printing, Italy, the center of religion, and France, home to early universities. This artifact is an ex libris design for a book collector named Johann Nabensburg from about 1450. The ex libris, or bookplate, features a humorous woodcut of a porcupine with the inscription, "Hans Igler, that the hedgehog may kiss you." A printed ex libris infers that a person owns enough books to justify having a bookplate especially designed and printed for identifying their collection. Igler, Nabensburg's nickname, is similar to the German word for hedgehog, making this one an early graphic pun. Let's focus on the genre of German popular literature, a distinct contrast to the theological and scholarly books published by most other early printers. These illustrated books feature woodblock prints and covered popular secular topics including poetry, novels, and nonfiction. This version of the popular tale The Plowman from Bohemia is one of the two earliest printed books in German and an important work of German literature. It was printed and illustrated in 1463. Here, Death sits as a king on his throne, flanked by a widower and his child on the left and a deceased wife on the right. The writer's scintillating dialogue between Death and a farmer was penned the day after the author lost his wife in childbirth. In the history of Bohemia, the plowman is an important symbol of the Bohemian kings. These scenes are from a contemporary production of the play presented in English in the year 2015.
That of which you know nothing, you should pass over in silence.
We have told you, the death of all mortals cannot be haggled over like a cheap bolt of cloth. Death is not a kingdom you can choose not to enter. We are the toll gate. We are the customs. At our feet, all must empty out their lives through us. All men must...
Zehner's illustrations helped to popularize this work, which has now entertained audiences for over 500 years. Gunther Zehner's masterpiece, The Speculum, or Mirror, of Human Salvation, was printed in 1473. Zehner introduced a greater tonal range to page design by creating woodcuts with textured areas and some solid blacks. The unity of character between Zehner's type and the blocks makes the book one of the most beautiful of the incunabula of Northern Europe. Johann Zehner was related to Gunther, perhaps his brother. Johann's illustrations used a very even line weight, and his beautiful woodcut capital initials were printed rather than added later by hand, as on this page from a circa 1473 edition of Petrarch's The Story of Griselda. Another printer, Anton Sorg, must have borrowed or purchased Zehner's woodcuts. Sorg used a wider column width than Zehner and tried to compensate for the lack of alignment between the illustration and the type column with a margin of white. This white space above and below the illustration works nicely with the more open illustration style, having no borders on portion of the illustration, and set it apart from the dense text. Another innovator in early books was Erhard Roerich. He was the first illustrator to be recognized as such in a book, the first to use crosshatch technique in woodcut, the first to use fold-out illustrations in a book, and he made the first illustrated travel book to be printed, with the first authentic printed town views. Roerich traveled with the author Bernhard von Breidenbach, a wealthy canon of the cathedral at Mainz, who journeyed to the Holy Land in 1483. He printed the first 3 editions of the Peregrinatio at his home during the period 1486 to 88. The Peregrinations, or Travels in Montem Sion, or Travels in Mount Zion, had fold-out, full-page illustrations and survive as an important visual record of early cities. During this period in Europe, society was divided into strict classes. There were those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. In other words, the nobility, the clergy, the military, merchants, laborers, and artisans. The development of guilds during the later Middle Ages was a crucial stage in the professional development of artists. The power of the artists during this period was not based on their individual capacities, as developed in the Renaissance, but on their willingness to join together and act as a collective. Guilds were self-governing groups of craftsmen. To enter required a period of apprenticeship as long as 12 years, followed by a period as a journeyman or hired by the dayman, and then the attainment of mastery. The word guild derived from the European word for gold. There was good money in skilled craftsmanship. Guilds existed in Middle East and Asia before Europe. In the earliest years, the printing guild was wide open, being new. It was easier to become a printer than a baker. Eventually, the Nuremberg Woodcutters Guild negotiated rights to illustrate books printed there. Guilds made it hard to gain access to materials or knowledge or sell into certain markets for those lacking the membership. Outsiders were not welcome. Guilds might hold patents, charters, or trade secrets and provided financially for widows and orphans of their membership. As the industry developed, Anton Koberger became Germany's most esteemed printer, publishing over 230 books. At the peak of his business, he employed 100 craftsmen in his workshop compound, ran 24 presses, and sold the resulting wares in 16 bookshops. Koberger's masterpiece was the Nuremberg Chronicle. It featured woodcuts by Michael Wohlgemuth, was written by Hartmann Schedel, and printed by Koberger. The German translation and some of the interior design were by George Alt. This edition was in German, and 15 others were in Latin. The 600-page chronicle was a history of the world from the biblical dawn of creation until 1493. The master artist Michael Wohlgemuth created the exemplars, or layouts, for composition. These original sketches remain and are startlingly exact to the finished book layout. The artist and his workshop drew, cut, and corrected 1,809 illustrations and prepared the woodblocks for printing. Wohlgemuth was assisted by his apprentice, a young Albrecht Dürer, godson of the publisher Koberger. Different editions were offered with varying levels of decoration, embellished by hand with painted woodcuts, gilt initials, rubricated text, or elaborate bindings. This was an uncommon practice during the Unknobel period. The book begins with the biblical story of creation. Note the raised hand of God. This symbol, called a manicule, is repeated over several pages. An early reader highlighted an edition with his own pointing hand, or manicule symbol. Many of the woodblock illustrations were hand-painted later. Several of these portraits were used multiple times in the text. Koberger used 14 basic layouts, and the images often related to the text. Here, the mythological hero Hercules, the philosopher Aristotle, and the Latin writer Apuleius share a portrait. At least they're colored differently in this copy. Many illustrations were aimed to entertain illiterate readers. Some were sensational and some were hoaxes. Here we have some monsters of Asia, Alexander the Great's horse, people with strange heads, and people with very unusual body parts. By the late 1400s and early 1500s, there was an exciting mood of change in Europe. The Age of Discovery had begun. An explosion of new knowledge was spread by books, and great voyages of discovery by Columbus and other explorers redefined the world. Great wealth and empires were being created through trade, technology, and the exploitation of natural resources. The age we call the Renaissance was beginning. Let's meet Albrecht Dürer, the Leonardo of the Northern Renaissance. In his famous self-portrait in a pose traditionally reserved for Christ, we see the intensity of Dürer's gaze and his self-regard. The painting may have been reverent, a tribute to the blessing of a talent endowed from God. On his 2 trips to Venice at the dawn of the Italian Renaissance, Dürer studied anatomy, proportion, and perspective. In addition to his detailed close observations from nature, he painted subjects from the classical world and the Bible. There, Dürer got the idea of artist as genius, working not just with the hands, but with the mind. He was treated for the first time as a gentleman, wined and dined and praised, and the rich and famous of Europe knew him from his prints. Dürer was a shrewd businessman. He had sales reps throughout Europe and bartered, sold, and traded prints for everything from a ferryboat passage to a large and comfortable home. In addition to his hit book about the end of the world, he papered Europe with a broadside depicting a strange and marvelous creature he had only heard about, the rhinoceros. With 2 books published at the end of his life, Dürer tried to educate other artists and spread the knowledge he had learned in Italy. He believed German artists lacked the technical education and theoretical knowledge of the Italian masters. In a treatise on human proportions, he gave detailed instructions about anatomy and the human figure. And in a course on the art of measurement, he passed on technical tips and tools for draftsmen and presented variations for each character in the alphabet. The German illustrated book continued to develop, moving into the Renaissance period. This novel about chivalry, published by Johann Schoensberger, was illustrated by Durer's student Hans Schäuflein. It was commissioned by the German Emperor Maximilian and took 5 years to produce. The flamboyant calligraphic gestures are appropriate for this romantic novel about chivalry. The swashes are carefully placed to animate the pages in the layout of the book. The metal typography, designed for Tour-d'Ankh by court calligrapher Vincent Rochner, had as many as 8 alternate characters for each letter and was meant to simulate calligraphy. In addition to books, broadsides began to circulate on the streets of Europe. One printed side of one sheet of paper was a broadside, and 2 sheets was a broadsheet. Broadsides eventually evolved into printed posters, advertisements, and newspapers. They publicized important news, events, fairs, and festivals. Anyone who paid for printing could distribute their message. One of the most important broadsides in history is this portrait of Martin Luther. It spread the news of Luther's radical resistance to the powerful Catholic Church as he disputed the claim that freedom from God's punishment for sin could be purchased with money. This commemorative portrait of Martin Luther bears the identification of the illustrator, Lucas Cranach's flying snake device, and the block cutter, a craftsman named Jorg, who is identified typographically above the date. Lucas Cranach the Elder operated a printing office, a bookshop, and a paper mill. Reformation books and broadsides, including many portraits of Martin Luther, were produced there. The Cranach family operated a printing office, a bookshop, and a paper mill. Although they helped to fuel the young Protestant Reformation, they also printed lots of matter for the Catholic Church. In the satirical Protestant book, A Passion of the Christ and the Antichrist, illustrations juxtapose the life of Christ with that of the clergy. In this spread, Christ labors under the weight of his cross, while the Pope travels in style in a sedan chair. Ultimately, the German publication of the Luther Bible translated the New Testament from Greek into German and made the Bible widely accessible to common people. It increased the breach with the Catholic Church and was instrumental in the religious upheavals of the Renaissance. Soon, the new technology of movable type spread to Italy, as the Cardinal invited some German printers to establish a press in Subiaco. Lactantius's Opera was the first religious book printed in Italy on the first Italian printing press. The text is set in the earliest typeface designed and cast by Swenem and Panarts, and shows the first appearance of Greek style rather than textura letters in the history of printing. Next, printing came to England via one man, William Caxton. Englishman William Caxton was apprenticed in the textile trade, then trained as a woodcutter and printer in Belgium and Germany, and set up a press in Bruges where he printed in English. With religious conflict heating up, he eventually fled back to England and published nearly 90 books. The eccentric, jerky type used by Caxton ushered the era of the typographic book into the British nation. He said, "My pen is worn and my eyes are dimmed from too much looking at white paper." Caxton printed copies of nearly all of the works of English literature in existence. His work stabilized the English language and its shifting dialects. His books may have had crude designs, but they were important to our culture. His printer's trademark is a stylized version of his initials and the first English publishing company logo. In France, 3 more Germans, sponsored by the Sorbonne, imported the new art of printing. In this Book of Hours of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the dense type and illustrations simulated the more familiar style of illuminated manuscripts. The dense, complex illustration, typography, and ornaments compressed into the space is typical of Philippe Picouchet's book design. Note the ornament, the pattern, and the medieval look. This costly edition printed on vellum clearly demonstrates the continuity of page design from manuscripts to the era of printing from movable type. French illustrators also invented a new style of tonal shading called criblé. In this technique, black areas of a woodblock are punched with white dots to create delicate half-toned shades from a solid black. Lastly, we head to Spain, where, what a surprise, German printers set up shop. In this title page, the title itself almost becomes an afterthought. The use of white on black woodblocks and heraldic imagery is typical of early Spanish graphic design. A fascinating relic of the dawn of the new sophisticated international Renaissance is the Polyglot Bible, printed in England by Thomas Roycroft. In it, the text is translated into 5 languages using a carefully constructed grid system to accommodate the different lengths. Imagine, in less than 50 years, as printing had spread around the world, a new dialogue between nations had begun.